Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome to you all on behalf of the organizers of this event, the Doha Forum based in Qatar and the Stimson Center based in the United States. My name is Mariam Namazi. I'm here in London and I'm delighted to moderate today's discussion on this year's Doha Forum report. Of course, this year focusing on new and old crisis, global and regional cooperation in the age of epidemic uncertainty. Now, obviously, it's been a very busy year, 2020. There's been a terrible human cost to the pandemic, over 1.3 million deaths and 50 million confirmed cases of the infection. Of course, those are the figures as of early November. And it's shown itself not just to be a public health crisis, but it's also really exposed and exacerbated existing social and economic challenges. It's been a major test for political leaders, for global institutions, and it was all very unexpected. It happened on an enormous scale. It moved with breakneck speed. And as we know, it's given rise to this incredible feeling of uncertainty and loss of control. It's been a stressful, chaotic, emotionally disruptive, all of those things I think we've all experienced on some level. But I think also it's important to emphasize that this crisis has really highlighted the importance of common purpose, collaboration, and teamwork. So with that in mind, the 2020 Doha Forum report is being formally launched today. Now, this comes ahead of this week's Heads of State and Government special session of the UN General Assembly on the COVID-19 response. This is the plan for today's program. We're going to first focus on the initial international response to COVID-19 from major global institutions, of course, like the United Nations, the G20, the World Bank, and the World Health Organization. Then we're going to take a look at the role of the business community and civil society organizations, how they've partnered with those international organizations and governments in that effort. And then we're going to look at some of the key parts of a proposed 3-year plan, the so-called Green Global Recovery Program for the virus pandemic. And that, of course, alongside a global institutional revitalization project. And that builds off of this year's 75th anniversary of the United Nations. So we're very fortunate to have with us several distinguished panelists and speakers. We're going to start by getting an overview of the major findings and policy recommendations from this year's Doha Forum report. To that end, I will now introduce His Excellency Sheikh Mishal Al-Thani, Ambassador of the State of Qatar to the United States and the former permanent representative of the State of Qatar to the United Nations. So the plan is first hear from Sheikh Mishal. We will then hear from President and Chief Executive Officer of the Stimson Center, Brian Finlay, and then I'll bring in the 4 panelists to shed some more light on the report's findings. We'll have a little bit of a discussion. Now, I just have to tell you all that there will be a chance at the end of that discussion to ask some questions. We really want to hear from you all in the audience. Please use the Zoom webinar Q&A function to post those questions. Keep them as focused as you can. Try to share your name, your country, your professional affiliation when you do that. I know that we have people from all over the world tuning into this, and that's really important to us today because obviously the international perspective and approach really underpins the purpose of why we're all here today. And of course, it's how that sort of cooperation can help us deal with these challenges, sharing our experiences and our insight and coming up with those new solutions. So don't forget to start getting your questions in from now because we really want to hear from you. Our panelists want to hear from you as well. Let me begin then with Sheikh Mishal. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Ms. Namazi, for the kind introduction, and to Brian and the Stimson Center team for collaborating with the Doha Forum on such a timely and substantive report on the role that global governance, institutions, and novel public-private partnership can have in seeking a durable and equitable recovery from the pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic is undoubtedly the greatest challenge to confront the international community in many decades. Over 1.4 million deaths, more than 60 million confirmed infections, and a projected 4.4% contraction in global GDP in 2020. The pandemic is threatening to push millions of people back into extreme poverty, into food deprivation, and millions of jobs have been lost. No country, no region has been spared or can tackle this challenge alone. If on the one hand, the pandemic exposed some challenges in international and global responses, on the other hand, there have been many instances of international solidarity and cooperation. Public-private actors pulled together for joint fundraising drives and other initiatives, such as the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator and its vaccines pillars, COVAX. These are just a few of the many responses measures that illustrates the type of global coordination and solidarity needed. Under the directives of His Highness Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, Emir of the State of Qatar, Qatar revamped its international support on various fronts, including a contribution of $20 million to the World Vaccine Alliance and $10 million for WHO. We've also provided urgent medical assistance to dozens of countries, amounting to nearly $90 million. We are also extremely concerned with the impact of the pandemic on the LDCs, LLDCs, and SIDS. Sadly, these countries are now at greatest risk of losing hard-won development gains. Thus, it is critical that we support them responding to the pandemic effectively, and also help them to be on track to achieve the 2030 agenda. We are glad that Doha report makes specific mention of the challenges and responses needed to support these group of countries. We hope the forthcoming 5th United Nations Conference on the least developed countries to be held in Doha 23-27 January 2022 will help building an ambitious new program for action for LDCs as the final decade of action for the 2030 agenda gathers pace. At home, Qatar was able to implement proactive responses that quickly identified COVID-19 infections and limited the spread of the virus, in addition to national stimulus packages to offset the sudden increase of unemployment in service sector. The undermining of global institutions, norms, and cooperation over the past years has further strained the multilateral system, which paradoxically is key to confronting present and future transitional risks and challenges. The pandemic has revealed that a collapse of the multilateral system is simply unacceptable, and that transitional threats require solidarity and multi-stakeholder forms of global collaboration among governments, civil society, and the private sector. No nation, no matter how large or how powerful, can alone address a pandemic or climate change. We are truly all in this together. We have seen over the past year the enormous solidarity among people worldwide and how innovative kind of public-private partnership have managed to respond to the virus and its economic effects. Moving forward, such partnerships can spur innovation through new technologies and by promoting decent job and wealth creation opportunities. In conclusion, only through truly multilateral and multi-stakeholder cooperation, facilitated by international institutions, can this global crisis be tackled. Furthermore, deriving important lessons from how the international community learns to better cope with the COVID-19 crisis over the coming 6 to 12 months will help strengthen global cooperation for better addressing older, more intractable global problems. Thank you.
Sheikh Michel, thank you very much for kicking things off and for opening up the dialogue. I'll now hand over to Brian Finlay to make some remarks. Brian.
Thank you so much, Amir. We're so grateful to you for your willingness to do this once again with us. And of course to Sheikh Michel as well. He's always a difficult act to follow, and the entire Doha Forum team as well for collaborating with my colleagues on this year's Doha Forum report. Of course, Ambassador, we're despondent that we can't do this in person this year, but we'll really look forward to all being together in Doha next year, as you say. We're also thankful to Dr. Brundtland, not just for joining us today, but for co-authoring the foreword to this year's Doha Forum report. Thank you so much, Dr. Brundtland. We look forward to hearing from you a little later as well. And last, I just want to hold up Richard Ponzio, who, of course, as always, is our homegrown maestro and director of our Just Security 2020 program here at the Stimson Center. So colleagues, successfully meeting the challenge, not just of COVID-19, but also the other many global challenges that the ambassador referred to, from climate change to rising political violence requires not just an effective roadmap for modernizing our global governance infrastructure, but one that charts, I think, a durable and broad-based recovery from this pandemic. And so with your permission, Miriam, I'd like to just really briefly outline a few of the core elements of a comprehensive global recovery plan that are proposed in this year's report as it relates specifically to global governance, and with a focus really on 4 critical dimensions. So those are number 1, not surprisingly, public health, human rights, and social protection. 2, building economies that are robust, efficient, and fair. 3, economic recovery that doubles as effective climate action. And lastly, a greater and more inclusive digital connectivity. So with that, I would just like to also touch on 3 other priorities, I think, for strengthening global institutions intended to complement and deliver on this global recovery agenda, all while keeping an eye, of course, on the some of the longer standing transnational challenges that we have struggled with for so long. So under the first dimension that I mentioned of global recovery, supporting public health, human rights, and social protection, we note in the report that the high coronavirus-related mortality rates in many countries, Brazil, India, and elsewhere, are due, in part at least, to insufficient healthcare systems, not surprisingly, and lack of access to water and sanitation facilities. Well, we can see I think, brightening light at the end of the coronavirus tunnel that we are all in together. I think we should also assume that this pandemic will not be unique in history, and therefore we called upon in the report for expanded investments for primary health care, sanitation, and public health. Under the second dimension, on facilitating economies that are robust, efficient, fair, and opportunity building, particularly for entrepreneurs and for youth, we pointed to the fact that most countries are falling or have fallen into recession as a result of this crisis. And we see a projected 10% contraction in global trade, and therefore recommend in our report, for instance, the need to strengthen supply chains and modernize the global trading system. This might include, for instance, incorporating innovative technologies, fostering e-commerce, ensuring the inclusion of small and medium-sized enterprises, and so forth. For the third dimension, fostering a green recovery, decarbonization, and a broader knowledge base for climate action, we cite evidence on how, for example, only 1 out of every $6 of infrastructure stimulus back in 2009, 2010 went toward climate-friendly investments that sourced energy from renewables. And we therefore propose that this time around, governments prioritize a green recovery as integral to national post-COVID-19 strategies. And I think this will help to ensure not just a cleaner environment, but healthier citizens, and importantly, to the ambassador's remarks, greater progress, I think, toward meeting the Sustainable Development Goals as well. And fourth and final dimension focused on strengthening digital connectivity, infrastructure, and public awareness. So just during the recent lockdown in many countries, think about this: 463 million children globally were unable to access remote learning due to wide gaps in digital connectivity. Think about that for a moment. It should be clear, I think, that further investments on information and communications technology infrastructure, in particular through public-private partnerships, are clearly necessary to ensure digital effectiveness and readiness, to limit interruptions of essential services, and to ensure the steady digitalization of most public services. Now, on a closely related subject of global institutional revitalization, the Doha Forum report this year highlights one recommendation for each of the main pillars of UN engagement. For the peace and security pillar, a much enhanced UN post-conflict civilian response capacity would facilitate rapid deployment of civilian specialist skills in conflict prevention and peace building efforts worldwide. For the sustainable development pillar, a better alignment of UN and G20 priorities and symmetry, what we have termed G20 plus, could accelerate recovery from COVID-19. For the human rights pillar, strengthening a rather stronger working ties between the Human Rights Council, the International Criminal Court, the UN Security Council, could certainly reinforce the effectiveness of each of those institutions. Culminating in the work of the Service of Global Pandemic Recovery and Revitalization of Global Institutions, we also call on the convening of a World Summit on Inclusive Global Governance. Now, in this regard, the recently adopted UN 75 declaration mandates the Secretary General to recommend ways to advance its 12 commitments across the UN agenda. This creates, I think, the possibility for member states, for the UN Secretariat, and non-governmental partners to also rally behind an ambitious global institutional revitalization effort. So this year, our report, which again I commend to all of you, lays out a number of milestones on that road to a 2030 World Summit that should include at least two G20 summits with the goal of building political momentum, a series of preparatory committee sessions focused on key pillars from peace and security to the abatement of the climate crisis, and ultimately that 2023 World Summit that would seek to, one, upgrade and equip the global governance system to address major issues facing the international community, but also to usher a new compact with citizens to enhance, to rebuild confidence in multilateral institutions, something that is, as we know, increasingly lacking around the globe. So in conclusion, with the happy news around the expected arrival of one or more effective vaccine candidates, the road, I think, to recovery must avoid a return to the old normal. This is particularly so as we confront, I think, an even more worrisome slow motion pandemic, if you will. And I speak, of course, of climate change. We believe that achieving early wins will build confidence among political leaders and the general public alike. And this will ultimately create a virtuous cycle that improves the political conditions for a more ambitious and complex set of goals, including a renewed global governance architecture that better promotes justice and security for all. So Miriam, once again, I thank you again for doing this, and to all of you for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Brian. And of course, thank you to Sheikh Mishal as well, both of you, for encapsulating the findings and recommendations of the report. Sets the scene quite nicely now for our panel discussion. So I would like to welcome on our screens the four panelists. Her Excellency Dr. Gro Harlem Brundtland, co-chair of the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, also former Prime Minister of Norway, former Director General of the World Health Organization, and former chair of the World Commission on Environment and Development. We also have with us Professor Sultan Barakat, founding director of the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. Pleased to welcome Dr. Reem Al-Mansour, a postdoctoral researcher at the Hamad bin Khalifa University in Doha and a member of the Doha Forum Report research team. And last but not least, Dr. Richard Ponzio, Senior Fellow and Director of the Just Security 2020 program at the Stimson Center. So thank you to the panelists for joining us. And Dr. Brundtland, if I can start with you, as we were hearing from Sheikh Mishal there and Brian as well, really over the past year, we have seen the pandemic pose a very clear, difficult test for the international response, which has been slow and divided. Have international global institutions failed us in their response?
Certainly, we do need a much more and stronger leadership at all levels, and we do need reform of our international system. This we have seen over these last 9 months. We should all now have learned about our interdependence and the dangerous attacks on our multilateral system by the leading country building our system after 1945 has undermined our ability to tackle the greatest crisis the world has faced since the Second World War. So preventing and tackling pandemics is in fact the foremost example of a global public good. And it requires global cooperation. COVID-19 has demonstrated the world is not prepared and was not prepared, and that our existing global system is woefully inadequate. Now, the GPMB, the Global Monitoring Board that you mentioned, has called for extensive reforms and a UN summit on global health security to strengthen and direct a global health security summit, which we need even before 23, which is the proposed broader agenda of the Doha report. Because this is more urgent, we need to strengthen, direct, and regulate the cooperation which is linked to global health security, because we need to respond far more effectively to the next pandemic. And indeed, it is essential that vaccines are now made available to all around the world.
And Dr. Brundtland, can I just actually, you make a very good point there about vaccine distribution. That's really key right now, isn't it? Particularly as we have all this news coming out about the progress that they're making. Now, how do you, we've really seen governments doing bilateral deals with drug makers to secure access for their own citizens. How do you stop that? How can you secure equitable, fair vaccine distribution?
Well, we have the dilemma as you are describing, but happily, there are also global efforts through what has already been mentioned, the ACT accelerator, and that is a multilateral mechanism that has been initiated by WHO and in partnership with a number of other actors. However, that partnership needs urgent funding. In fact, the world's richest countries now need to contribute to the 30 billion that are needed from now and through 2021 to make possible distribution of vaccines across the world, first to critical personnel and then gradually to the whole population.
Right. Okay, well, let me pick up on that point, Dr. Brundtland. Let me head to Professor Barakat, because actually you have done a great deal of research on fragile conflict-affected countries. I wanted to ask you about that point that Dr. Brundtland makes, because there was some analysis from Duke University finding that high and middle-income countries have already purchased 3.8 billion doses of promising vaccines. They have options for 5 billion more. The concern now is that billions of people in developing countries could be waiting until 2024. So, Professor Barakat, with the rich taking the lion's share of future vaccine doses, are the world's most vulnerable going to be left out?
I think the likelihood is that, yes, they will be left out. And this is not the first time they are being left out. They're suffering from many other diseases and issues that are spread in fragile states that have not been considered by the rich countries for a long time. What is particularly difficult when it comes to COVID-19 is that the nature of the disease requires really an attention to public health, and public health requires strong institutions locally for it to work. And many of those fragile states for many, many years have turned their attention from national public health to curative health and primary, very basic health support. And this is what the international community has been providing to them. So far, the numbers coming from those countries are not very high. And I think that's largely because the reporting is not there. But it could also be because of the isolation they're in. And that could be maybe the silver lining for being in a zone of conflict, is that they have not really mixed with the rest of the world. The connectivity has been very, very low. And maybe the disease has not spread as much. But that doesn't mean that it won't as we relax again and the third wave may be coming in the coming
so Professor Barakat, can I ask you then, just to get a sense of the economic and the health consequences, they're huge, aren't they? If you vaccinate the entire EU and the US because they have the wealth to afford it. I mean, if you have 30 or 40 countries that have vaccines and then over 100 that don't, the epidemic just carries on. It keeps moving around. So there's no going back to normal after a vaccine. There's no normal for commerce, trade, travel, tourism, unless you slow the pandemic globally.
Of course, but there is also the risk of some arguing that because these areas of conflict are relatively isolated, you can't just go in and out of them as freely as you do in Europe and America, then the problem will remain localized problem. And this has been the case with other diseases that have spread in these areas, and they still have not been tackled sufficiently at the global level. So I think in relation to the report, it is good to emphasize the multilateral approach to this and the global need to act, but also it is very important to emphasize the need to act locally and to strengthen capacities at the very local level in those conflict-affected countries.
Reem, if I can come to you, do you feel that there's been sufficient post-vaccine recovery planning by international organizations like the UN, like the World Bank?
Well, answering your question, Miriam, I do feel that there have been some efforts going on to resolve this problem. However, and we have seen this in the analysis we have done, that even though there are good initiatives to help, overcome the inequality that made this pandemic harder on certain regions, countries, and also groups of people. So these efforts that we are, directing toward helping these regions did suffer from some limitations. And when I say limitations, even though they are ambitious, they have good intentions, they do lack certain strategic planning. And I would like to mention just a few of them. So for instance, one being the slow process for approving loans and distributing them. Another disadvantage or limitation, I would say, the fact that it lacks a long-term vision. And when I say long-term vision, I'll give you an example. So the partnerships for accelerating COVID testing, for instance, in Africa, has done a very good job in raising money and then also donating millions of testing kits. However, they have been criticized for not building a resilient system for their laboratories, for instance. And we know that this region suffers from a number of other diseases as well, and prone to have more in the future. Also, another limitation would be, as you mentioned briefly, the increase in nationalism and the competition, the geopolitical competition when it comes to the vaccine. Big countries, powerful, that we are relying on, have refrained from participating in the COVAX, for instance. And then, as you mentioned also, they preferred the unilateral approach for developing their own, away from the collective efforts that the global community is participating in. And this will also enlarge the gap between rich and poor countries as well. So yeah, to name a few of them, these are some limitations. If we don't look into them and work on resolving these limitations as soon as possible, I don't think this planning for the future would be sufficient right now.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Reem. And Richard, of course, we were speaking there at the start of the discussion about the response of international institutions, and it really felt at one point like the World Health Organization was facing its own major crisis in the middle of this pandemic, when it was not only attacked by the US president, but couldn't then seem to convince its 194 member states to follow its guidance. I guess the problem at the end of the day is that it has very little power. Like other international bodies, it can't actually penalize or sanction its members.
Thank you, Miriam. And first, let me begin. It's wonderful to have you in today's program. And of course, Dr. Brundtland, Professor Barakat, and my colleague, Reem. Let me make clear that we don't single out the World Health Organization in this report. As Reem has just noted rightly, we are concerned about the international community response as a whole. We believe it's been fragmented, delayed, ad hoc, and under-resourced. This UN summit that Miriam referred to that's happening this week better late than never. As the President of the General Assembly, His Excellency Volkan Bozkır, has also noted, given the gravity of this crisis, it's remarkable that it's only taking place now. As we write in the report, the World Health Organization declared, and this is very important language, a public health emergency of international concern 10 months ago, and now we're having this important summit. Now, on your question about the WHO, the World Health Organization, it is the world's global apex body. Our own thinking, as we show in the report, is that given its resources, its actual formal authorities that it possesses, it's performing what you would expect for such an organization. It's under many political and under other constraints by its member states. Now, with that said, the WHO was slow in declaring this public emergency of international concern earlier this year. And as you may recall, there was mixed messaging about the use of masks early on that created some confusion. But it's the issue that got the most attention with China. The decision at first not to recommend closing the borders with China, something that the WHO doesn't have the authority to do, but it could have made a public statement. And that brought it under a lot of scrutiny by the United States and other major countries that it was getting too close under the influence of one major country, China. And that led to a lot of tension, as we all saw, where the US declared we're not going to be financing the WHO. And then even the big step in June, declaring that it would not withdraw its membership. It would withdraw from the World Health Organization. That fortunately is not going to happen now, as we all know. But just to say, there are problems in the multilateral system as a whole, and the WHO was caught up with the political rivalry between China and the United States.
Okay, Richard, thank you. I want to move on now to the role of public-private partnerships in not just responding to the emergency phase of the pandemic. And of course, as we've said, there could be pandemics in the future. So lessons to be learned on that, but also how these sort of partnerships can contribute to those long-term recovery efforts. And actually, before I go into my second round of questions, just want to remind you all that you will have a chance to put your own questions to our panelists. So please post them using the Zoom Q&A function. State your name, country, organizational affiliation, and we'll put those questions to our panelists in just a couple of minutes. So please make sure you do that. Dr. Brundtland, if I can come to you for just your general thoughts on both private sector and civil society, how they've responded to fighting the pandemic and the effect it's had on people around the world.
You know, in all our collaboration, we are dependent on governments, but we have a whole of society approach. And we need the private sector, civil society. We need an informed public and their awareness, which is why we in the GPMB has, advised a whole of government and the whole of society approach. Now, this has obviously also happened in many places at local and even regional level, national level, obviously, many places. Because we need to be sure that everyone understands that we are in this together, and in protecting ourselves, we are protecting one another as well. Now, for instance, vaccine reluctance, even misinformation, conspiracy being spread, that's a dangerous trend many places, because as we know that an effective vaccine, which we obviously now are getting several of, that is something that can help us have an earlier end to the whole pandemic and this crisis. So here is also something that needs collaboration across all sectors involving the private sector to help us ensure that public awareness and public knowledge is addressed in such a way that we can do the right thing to avoid a worsening of the situation. Now, non-state actors played a pivotal role also in the creation of the ACT accelerator that we have already discussed several times. Without international organizations and private-public partnerships, we wouldn't have been where we are. But of course, as we have both the professor has said and I have said, there is lack of funding. So it's urgently necessary to promote and to help that public-private partnership to do what we all are dependent upon, to spread the vaccine and the therapeutics and all that is needed across the world.
Richard, Dr. Brundtland speaking there about there being a lack of funding, and then, you know, there has been also concern about the unintended consequences of public-private partnerships. For example, Oxfam recently reported, as you know, that 32 of the world's most profitable companies are on course to exceed their profits from the past 4 years by 109 billion in 2020. It's the same story with the world's 25 wealthiest billionaires. They've managed to increase their wealth this year as well. I mean, are we going to, why, I mean, there's no reason really for there to be a lack of funding on something like this. And could we see something similar happen now with recovery efforts, this wealth gap spike?
Let me begin. We do cite the Oxfam data in this report that you just referred to, and there are many other limitations to public-private partnerships. Let's not pretend that they're a panacea to solve all types of global problems, including climate change, but they're a very important contributor. But let me start by noting some of the other weaknesses besides the vast accumulation of wealth, which can be dangerous if not put towards proper ends, global public goods, as it's often called. The two that we highlight are lack of enforceable accountability. You know, one of the strengths of these public-private partnerships, their informality, can also be one of their downsides, especially when they fall victim to what's called forum shopping. They join a partnership for a short while and then they lose interest suddenly, deserting it altogether, or at least lessening their engagement and going elsewhere. So these are very real concerns, but they bring such tremendous strengths. And the three that we highlight that also Sheikh Michel referred to in his opening remarks: promoting decent job and wealth creation opportunities, expanding digital connectivity. You can't participate in the global marketplace today without being online. And then a related concept that we called networked governance, bringing all these different capabilities to bear on a given global action problem. Some of the examples we highlighted: working with the UK Department of International Development is the Dutch-British consumer goods giant Unilever. It has employed 150,000 plus people around the world, but its work on COVID recovery has been noteworthy in the sense of donating critical public health tools and undertaking a global hygiene campaign. Something that we highlighted at our UN 75 Global Governance Forum in September that Dr. Brundtland and Ms. Namazi participated in was the ITU, the International Telecommunications Partnership Dialogue for Connectivity. This is with some of the big giants in the tech world: Google, Facebook, Microsoft, many other digital service providers. They're focused on the 3.6 billion people that are estimated to not be online and have access to affordable internet. The final one, and most pertinent to our discussion today, we call out as an example of network governance, India's Serum Institute, working with Gavi, the Intergovernmental Vaccine Alliance, and the Gates Foundation. They're working to bring affordable, accessible vaccines, 200 million doses sometime in 2021, to low and middle income countries. So they have many, many strengths that they bring to bear for such a global recovery effort, and we hope those capabilities will be taken full advantage of.
Richard, thanks very much. Professor Barakat, if I can come to you, just building off of what we've heard there from Richard and of course Dr. Brundtland, can you give us examples of where public-private partnerships have supported the humanitarian response to COVID in developing countries?
Well, my area of sort of specialism really is fragile states that tend to have conflict ongoing in most cases. And by definition, because of lack of state ability, civil society kind of steps in and steps up its action in those countries. So much of the services are run by private foundations and civil society organizations and so on. The real risk that we face, I think, is the fact that the global recession that we heard about earlier on, the 10% reduction in GDP, will inevitably be reflected in terms of the amount of money donor countries are willing to give to developing countries as a whole and to fragile states in particular. I think that will have an effect, and we'll probably start feeling it very soon. So far, it has had the effect, the COVID-19 has had the effect of diverting attention from other health issues to COVID-related issues. Despite the fact that we all know that in many of those countries, the infrastructure for to track and trace, or the infrastructure to provide vaccines, to reach out to people and so on, is not there in the first place. So there has been a lot of shifting in priorities, and those civil society organizations and NGOs in country have really been confused, because for many, many years they've been worked with to target certain priorities, and then suddenly we're all running after them saying COVID-19 is the priority. And that has really caused some problem. The fact that much of what is given so far in terms of support for COVID-19 is focused on protection equipment, PPE, and alcohol liquids and so on. All of these are consumable items that are not really going in the economy, and they're coming imported from outside, and they're not being generated anywhere near those fragile states. So economically also, it's going to have a very big effect on those countries as they emerge out of this pandemic.
Okay, thank you. And Reem, if I can come to you, because obviously we're now looking increasingly to the future and not losing sight of the other challenges that we face as economies try to rebuild from COVID-19. And we hear a great deal about this environmentally friendly green recovery. Can you give us an example from the Doha Forum report that you think best illustrates the contributions that non-state actors are making in that respect?
Yeah, so regarding the green recovery, I just would like to remind the audience in here that in 2008-2009 global financial crisis, when the CO2 emission decreased by 1.4%, which is an event that almost everybody has celebrated back then, the following year, or when the governments around the world were trying to revitalize their economies, so this emission level jumped up to 5% of an increase. So this is exactly an illustration of the opposite of what we mean by green recovery. We should not waste this important achievement that we have achieved, even if it was not an intentional let's say, decrease in emission by almost 9% during this pandemic. So what we need to do is not to go back to the old normal way of doing business. We need to go forward. And this actually was another concern by the WHO when they said that it needs to be green and healthy. It needs to take environment and people's health at the heart of every recovery plan. We need to have a quick switch to renewable energy as well. And to give you an example from the top country that has been ranked from the Global Response Index, which is in New Zealand. New Zealand, for instance, has the green recovery at the heart of their recovery plan. They're considering infrastructure that decreases the CO2 emission and also preserve the energy. They're also considering better management for waste, and these are just few examples for green recovery.
Thank you so much, Reem. That's really interesting, and actually we're going to get into the detail just now in our final round of questioning about really how to chart the way forward to something that's durable and broad-based from this COVID-19 crisis. And so, Dr. Brundtland, let me come to you, because there has been so much economic stress as a result of the pandemic. Is it possible then to tackle COVID-19 and climate change at the same time?
Yes, I do think so. And I think not only people understand the interdependence that we all share, much more now because the COVID situation has affected people much more acutely and directly. But the consequences of that awareness is that we realize that the climate issues that seem further away from many people are of the same kind. They show our interdependence. So I think our crisis this year will improve the possibility of moving much more effectively to deal with the climate crisis, and that people more than before will understand the importance of sustainable development. Now, in that context, we can already see not only many governments, not only in New Zealand, others are preparing to strengthen their climate efforts. I mean, now we are having a new administration in the US, which will help all of us, that's for sure. But in any case, you see it in many places that there is an improvement in the attention also to climate. And also, much of the business community is aware that the reduction in emissions that Dr. Reem just referred to, that this time they know the trends forward means climate is going to give more financial risk to investments in fossil fuels. There is a change in the atmosphere also among the business community. And that will help all of us, the governments, people at large, and of course, the business community as such, that we are understanding this more deeply, all of us. So I believe we are moving, could be moving in the right direction, dealing with planetary health, public health, and climate at once. But let me add another issue in this context, and that is that I mentioned that our system, our mechanisms were woefully inadequate when the pandemic started. One of the issues that we saw from the GPMB is that our financial institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, they did not have a system that made it possible to deal with the economic recovery that was necessary, given that we had all the economic impact across the world, and of course, certainly to poor countries. Indebtedness has been partly dealt with, but indebtedness in so many global South countries can fundamentally undermine global recovery in the economy, but also with regard to the broader issues that we are now talking about. So here we have a big challenge to help with the indebtedness, especially in the global South.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Brundtland. Can I just ask you really briefly, if you wouldn't mind? I'm struck by what you said there about the cost of inaction when it comes to climate change, and actually it was insufficient. Climate action was insufficient even before the pandemic. We've not reduced our greenhouse gas emissions in line with the advice. You must be worried about the worst effects of climate change being much more serious than the disruption from the coronavirus.
Of course, the whole climate situation has proven that we have been too slow in addressing it over time, and that we now are in a situation where we really only have this decade to really turn the curve and get into a green development pattern. So it means rebuilding better, but rebuilding greener is essential. And we don't have time to lose on this. But I think that has been illustrated by so many experiences during these last 10 months.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Brundtland, for that. Reem, briefly, Reem, if I can come to you, COVID-19 has obviously collided with climate change. We've talked about that. Now, can you just give us one of the priorities or ideas laid out in the report about how you can integrate the two?
Yes, Miriam, as Dr. Brian mentioned briefly at the very beginning when he went through the 4 dimensions, one of the dimensions that we are addressing as a recommendation is the environmental dimension. and also economic, where we also integrate in green economic at the same time. So addressing the problem of better management for waste, for instance. So here we're recommending circular economy. So this will not only reduce the negative impact on the environment, but will also present some opportunities for entrepreneurs and youth and their ideas. And we're also mentioning that we need to increase the scientific-based literacy on global warming as well within the two crises. So to have it in an accessible language, to publicize it and impart this knowledge in a simple language and build a momentum within the society, that will help, just as we did when changing the public's behavior during this pandemic. So we can do the same regarding the climate change as well.
Thank you very much, Reem. And I'm just going to ask Richard and Professor Barakat two final questions, and then we'll come to Q&A from our audience. So just a couple of minutes to go and get your questions in if you haven't done already on that Q&A Zoom function. Richard, we heard earlier from Brian, your colleague Brian Finlay, that the recovery agenda is going to be combined with a revitalization of global institutions. Is that just a bit too broad, a bit too ambitious, when the priority should really be about saving lives and restoring economies?
It's true. They're both massive agendas, the global green recovery, as we've been discussing with Dr. Brundtland and Reem, and this renewal of global institutions, which my colleagues and I have been working on for a couple of years now. They have the same focus of harnessing talents and resources from a range of governments and of civil society, of course, the private sector we've been talking about today. You can make the case that, oh, we need to sequence one after the other, or at least be on distinct parallel tracks. We come up with three very clear comments about why an integrated approach is absolutely essential. First of all, the need for smooth policy coordination. When you consider there's going to be the need for prioritization, budgeting issues, you're going to need to deconflict policy goals as you work in a unified direction. A second argument is just the issue of outreach and analysis of progress. You're going to want to have a multiplier effect by joining forces, as you know, a lot about communicating your messages and how they reinforce one another to streamline that effort. But I think the most important argument is that what would be seen as the secondary concern, strengthening these multilateral institutions. When we make progress in that regard, this will reinforce and build momentum for the recovery agenda. And the same can be said vice versa. But it's all about building confidence, not only in political leaders, but the general public, and creating what we call a virtuous circle that will improve the conditions both for recovery and for pursuing more ambitious, complex strengthening of our multilateral system. Now, just to deal head on though, the fact is the detractors will say, hey, we just got to focus on the key issue right now is getting the vaccine out and getting economies going again. But I'm so glad that this conversation has turned so much to the climate challenge. It's an even bigger event. And Dr. Brundtland, of course, in her World Commission in 1987, coined sustainable development. We need to put those issues at the forefront. And the Secretary General is giving a speech, a major one at Columbia University as this program is happening on the climate challenge. So we can't afford to wait a couple of years until the recovery has played itself out. The two issues go hand in hand and can be positively reinforcing.
And Sultan Barakat, Professor Barakat, if I can come to you, I mean, do you echo those sentiments there by Richard Ponzio? Do you have any final thoughts on this?
Very much so. The only maybe additional point to emphasize is that we really have to look very carefully at the financing of those multilateral organizations. And we need to accept that the challenges presented to us by this pandemic and in the future maybe others does mean that the finance has got to be more consistent and more targeted towards the core of those organizations. WHO and the challenges it faces is partly because of the change in its financing that they've suffered from over the last few years, where their real capacity in country and internationally have eroded over the years because many of the donors have shifted towards projects and sudden priorities and specific campaigns. And I think there is a need to reverse that somehow. And if we are serious about taking a global action, then we have to address this head on. The other point is maybe we need a greater degree of preparedness, including financial preparedness. I mean, maybe some form of a fund or an insurance policy to allow the world to respond to those nations that do not have the resources in these times of crisis, so that they don't have to compete with the well-off countries for vaccine and other priorities. There are a number of other issues I think one needs to look at, including the need to invest in digital connectivity. I mean, if one thing we learned from this disease is without having that ability in country, it's very difficult to track and trace and limit the spread of the disease. And it just emphasized again why digital connectivity is important, not just for day-to-day development and trade and so on, but actual health priorities globally. And I think these are the main points to emphasize, to add to what Richard has said.
Thanks very much, Professor Barakat. And actually, now we can come to some of the questions that we have from our global audience on Zoom. You still have a couple of minutes to send your questions in, so please do that. And Dr. Brundtland, if I can come to you with a question we have here from Corey Bott from Canada. My apologies, Corey, if I didn't pronounce that correctly. So Corey is asking Dr. Brundtland about the negative consequences of unilateralism and national or regional protectionism in the months and years to follow when it comes to vaccine availability and distribution. I mean, we touched on this earlier in the discussion, but the question is, in what ways might unfair distribution lead to new conflict or security issues? Is that something that we need to consider?
Well, it certainly is the major reasons why we need a global effort. Now, in Norway, some years ago, an institution called CEPI was created from the support of a number of countries for exactly seeing to it that as vaccines develop, you have a global effort and you have a responsibility as a country to be participating in the global distribution to other less fortunate parts of the world. That CEPI was already established, and it is part of what is happening with the ACT accelerating, working with them. So there are a number of initiatives and several countries who are part of also committing to share and to be part of funding the spreading of vaccine to other countries. However, it's not enough, which is why, I keep reminding people that the funding of ACT Accelerator and the vaccine initiatives is far from sufficient so far. And it's really up to rich countries now, including Canada, US, and others, to be part of finding that solution in time. Because as weeks and months now pass into 21, the distribution of vaccines to other parts of the world should already be ongoing.
Dr. Brundtland, thank you very much. A question here, interesting question here about Richard. Richard, maybe we can come to you on this. From Alexander Gorolik with the Interstate Cooperation for Development, speaking in the context of economic recovery, is it not important for governments to raise the progressiveness of their taxes? So obviously earlier on in the discussion, we were speaking about the wealth gap and inequality. Does the tax system, particularly in wealthier countries, have to be addressed now?
Absolutely. I mean, there's going to need to be trillions of dollars. We've already seen stimulus by the richest countries early this year, amounting to trillions to just as a stopgap measure. Nothing close to the recovery agenda that we outlined in this year's report. But what's so sad, and we highlight this in the report, The UN has only requested a $10 billion new fund for COVID recovery. Only a quarter of that has been met. A far fraction of what the World Bank and the IMF need. This is for dealing with the wider world, developing countries. So it shouldn't just be about taxation in the richer countries that will need to be revisited. And the other example, of course, in the US, major tax cuts in recent years under the current administration, that's expected to be reversed during the coming years in the US. But I think similar debates will play out in other countries, but it can't just be oriented towards your own population. We all know that the spread of the virus, if it continues around the world, it will affect all countries. Therefore, a global approach is necessary. But final quick point I'll say, with the taxation and the role of government, the role of global governance, the role of public sector actors at regional and global actors that we highlight, they're going to be more critical than ever, not just because of the recovery from the pandemic that we've been highlighting, but we've gotten at the heart, I think, at the same time of the climate challenge, but this whole issue of where globalization, economic globalization is going, core issues of equity and justice surrounding automation. It's not just the trade debates that end up hurting some industries and others benefiting, but it's automation. How are millions of people that are employed in sectors that are going to be outdated in the coming years? What is the role of public intervention? That has a lot to do with the taxation question that you pose.
Just coming off of that taxation question then, Dr. Brundtland, there is a question here from Chuck Woolery, former chair of the United Nations Council of Organizations, who asks, why is there such resistance to going after some of the $32 trillion stashed in offshore accounts by kleptocrats, oligarchs, criminal cartels, violent extremist groups, and criminally wealthy capitalists avoiding taxes? Is now the time for to tackle tax avoidance once and for all, because obviously these funds are going to be sorely needed to address the current crisis?
Absolutely. I mean, gradually, certainly the European Union has been quite, working on dealing with this issue. So it's not in Norway, certainly it's a major issue. Across party lines, a country like Norway is really trying hard to see what kinds of changes can be made. But also within the European Union, there are considerable efforts. But as we all know, it's not a simple issue. There are so many strong interests, and some of them hidden, others known, but still hard to deal with. So in my opinion, even in poor countries, it is important, many, at least developing countries, taxation is part of a solidarity society. So it's not only in rich countries that we need taxation, we need to have tax systems also in poor countries where many rich people live. And they are certainly not being taxed to the extent that they should. So the taxation issue is a global important issue, including the question that the person asked.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that, Dr. Brundtland. I'm just looking at some of the other questions now. And Dr. Barakat, maybe we can come to you for a question here, Professor Barakat, sorry about that. So actually we have Dr. Carl Wright, Secretary General of the Emeritus Commonwealth Local Government Forum and Chair of the Canterbury Climate Action Partnership in the UK. Question for you, Professor, pleased to hear that you emphasize the local level in post-COVID recovery. Would you agree this requires the UN and national governments to channel resources more through mayors and local government and community structures, and more widely ensuring localizing SDGs? So the importance of local governance in these recovery efforts, I guess.
Absolutely. Back in 2016, the Istanbul conference agreed on a certain percentage of aid that should be directed almost directly to NGOs and local organizations. But unfortunately, that has not been implemented fully, and it was hampered partly because of the COVID-19 pandemic. But the risk, I go back to the earlier point about the global recession, is that the existing donors will probably drop some of their aid levels. And in the UK, I don't know if it is going to be implemented, but they're talking about now cutting back their aid to below 0.7% of the GDP. And that, I think, would be a very dangerous route to take. And it is combined with the fact that they've combined their aid with their politics by merging the IFID with FCO. And all of this will reflect, I fear, negatively on developing countries, and particularly on the small set of fragile states that exist at the moment, and as such on the respread of the pandemic in the future.
And while I have you there, Professor Barakat, a question here from Wijdan Tariq from the University of Toronto, saying that was it unrealistic to have expected the pandemic was going to accelerate conflict resolution in different parts of the world? In that sense, has it been a missed opportunity, especially for fragile states?
Well, the call by the United Nations Secretary General for ceasefire was received well by all sides, in fact, and we were all very optimistic that it will be adhered to more strictly, and unfortunately it wasn't. I mean, there were one or two contexts where they called for a ceasefire. So in that sense, it has helped focus people's mind on the importance of a ceasefire, of stability in order to deal with the pandemic. It has had other negative effects in that many of the conflict resolution activities or processes that are ongoing were not able to be held because people cannot travel as they used in the past. People are not able to meet face to face and so on. So there has been some delays. And there are exceptions to this rule. As you know, the process that has been negotiated in Doha today to do with Afghanistan has in fact progressed. I would say maybe partly because of the pandemic, in that it has helped people A, decide that they need to take an action, and B, it helped the international community to decide that Qatar should be the host rather than the pandemic eliminated the competition that was ongoing as to where we have these talks. So it has, broadly speaking, there's been some positive and negative effects to do with the pandemic, but overall, the opportunity that existed by the call of by the UN Secretary General has not really materialized.
Thanks very much. Reem, if I can come to you, a question here from Chris Williams from RT Pay, speaking about the need for well, millions of dollars of financial support because of the economic impact of the pandemic. And basically saying that this is more urgent than the long-term environmental issues. I mean, and what's your response to that? That actually what needs to be prioritized? What does the Doha Forum report say about how to balance those two things? Obviously, serious consequences from the COVID-19 pandemic, perhaps taking priority over those long-term environmental issues.
Yes, thank you for your question. It's a very good question. We do have an urgent need regarding this pandemic. However, this does not give us the excuse for diverting all our resources toward one problem while neglecting the others. And actually, we have taken this point into consideration in the recommendations we have given at the very end of the report, where we had the pillars of sustainability at the heart of our recommendations. We are also considering or aligning our recommendations with the Paris Climate Agreement and the SDGs. So we're making sure to meet all these targets at once, because part of the recovery that we are seeking is not to go back to the old normal. We need a better future. That's why we're taking into consideration both crises, climate change and the pandemic.
Thank you very much, Reem. Thank you for that. I want to go to Richard actually now. Richard, if I can come to you. a question from Adwele Bakare from Global Governance 2.2. My apologies if I've mispronounced that. Question goes like this: the pandemic and the effect of climate change are global metrics that show how weakened our global governance structures are. In my opinion, I think it's about time we put the rights of people at the center of the UN system and operations. What's your take on this for effective global governance?
Absolutely critical. We celebrated the 75th anniversary of the UN this year in 3 years' time, because in 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights came into existence. So we're going to celebrate its 75 years. Let's not forget, that we use the language of recent years, I think since the Millennium Declaration of 2000, about people-centered multilateralism, and new norms were adopted, responsibility to protect at a UN anniversary in 2005. So there have been advances, but what happened to those amazing covenants on human rights back in the 1970s? Political, civil, but also economic, social, cultural rights. Of course, we're in the middle of the Cold War then. Today, it was been the post 9/11 international war on terror. And now, sadly, the COVID response, while, understandably, there have been constraints placed on societies out of their own safety, but some, we would argue, authoritarian governments, not all, but some argue that this is an opportunity to constrain societies' human rights, safeguarding basic human rights, and the whole issue of civic space at different levels of governments within countries, but we've even seen it at the UN. Everything has had to go online, and some meetings have been less accessible than they would be if we had the chance to interact with diplomats in New York directly. So bringing real teeth to this idea of a human rights-based approach in global governance and the forums of the UN, but more importantly, in action on the ground at the national, at the subnational level. This is a debate that is complex and mixed in terms of results and the realities that we're seeing than it's ever been. It's only been complicated by the COVID crisis. So we absolutely need to put this issue front and center. I think it did get a lot of attention during the UN 75 and the global conversation that the Secretary General sponsored. But in terms of making it a central part of all governments, including those that are less inclusive in their systems, their political systems, there's a lot of work to be done in that regard.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that, Richard. Dr. Brundtland, if I can come to you for a question here about, it's a general question. It's a very general question, but nonetheless, it's from Christoph Roland, speaking about the need for an international government that's competent and strong enough to unite 196 nations. Just a question about how this can happen. I mean, obviously we were speaking earlier in the discussion about the WHO, and I know that Richard said don't want to single out the WHO in this report or any one organization, but I suppose it's that the concern is that the international order on which the WHO and other institutions rely has been fraying because of nationalism, populism, those sort of things becoming normalized. So, where is this going to lead in future years? Should there be future pandemics?
Well, the World Health Organization has, of course, led, together with the World Bank and others, the action plans for global preparedness to health crises like this one. But what has happened is that even the decisions and the agreements that have been formalized in the World Health Assembly, like the international health regulations, they have not always been pursued in the way they were meant to be, and they are also in some points too weak. We have spoken here about accountability. If the World Health Organization and all its member states are not accountable to their own decisions and their own resolutions and even agreements, then we have a serious problem. And that problem needs to be solved. We need to address it. We need to strengthen these mechanisms, because this time we saw the danger of not being prepared and not doing what is necessary to recover when a crisis has come. So that's why the Global Health Security summit that we think needs to come in a year or so, because we need leaders of nations to realize all these weaknesses and deal with them directly. It has to be at the head of state and government level.
So, Richard, I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that. How, I mean, obviously we were saying earlier that these international organizations obviously don't have the power to force their members to do anything. How do you strengthen multilateral institutions when the sort of norms about public health and understanding of what's expected during an outbreak is, well, it feels like it sort of crumbled during this crisis?
The way change has come about, especially in recent times since the end of the Cold War, it's always through public pressure on often their elected leaders or even non-elected leaders. Governments without, enlightened leadership, which is rare these days in an age of rising nationalism, as we've seen even in democracies, the rise of populism, which sometimes erodes and undermines any kinds of international cooperation at the regional level, let alone globally. So what we need is to take look at the playbook of global governance strengthening in the last several decades since the end of the Cold War. Unheard of areas, the whole area of international criminal justice and the creation of the International Criminal Court in The Hague was very much supported and complemented, arguably would never have happened without a large coalition for the International Criminal Court. Same thing with the landmines campaign, Jubilee 2000 on debt relief at the time of the millennium. And now the climate movement, the most paramount global governance challenge of our time. So any of these changes that we wish to see in the present context, of course, everything is going to be, I think, filtered through the 2020, the year of the pandemic, and now the recovery from the pandemic, which, as we present in the report, is at least a full-on, all hands on deck, 3-year intensive project. But if our multilateral institutions aren't front and center in that conversation, they're going to be marginalized and further weakened to be able to act on what we contend and have discussed here with Dr. Brundtland and the work she's done on sustainable development. Those are the core issues. They're central to whether or not recovery is successful. These sustainable development goals, we're going to hit the halfway mark in 2023, which is when we're also advocating a World Summit on inclusive global governance in this report. But it's so important to make progress on the SDGs to finally get things on track with the Paris Climate Agreement. And there's even talk of a Paris Plus agreement, of some kind of binding, enforceable legal instrument that goes beyond the voluntary nature of the Paris Climate Agreement. These issues will not happen without immense public pressure. So that's why we are somewhat hopeful that some of the changes we've seen, the strong movement that occurred around the 75th anniversary of the UN, we can build on that progress to advance these changes on some of the hard and tractable issues of our time.
There's a really good question here, Dr. Brundtland. Maybe I can put this to you, and I don't know if any of perhaps the other panelists could might have some thoughts on this as well. Dr. Brundtland, a question here about the political rivalry between the US and China being expected to continue under the Biden administration, whether it's going to basically that the fact that rivalry is very counterproductive at a time when you're trying to forge a more united response to the pandemic. Is that political rivalry likely to continue and be a problem?
I'm afraid that the era of conflict between US and China is not over. And even with a Biden presidency, there is no easy and simple way to overcome that. However, I do believe that it is possible for the Biden presidency to move towards, and also with China responding, to being more cooperative on climate and on global health than maybe on every trade and other issues of conflict, which can be helpful both for China, for the US, and of course, certainly for the rest of the world, to try to bridge into a future where there is more collaboration and more mutual respect between these two major powers.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Brundtland, on that. And I'm just wondering, Professor Barakat, if you have any thoughts on that, the US-China rivalry.
Well, I agree that it is likely to continue, but I would like the rest of the world to try and exploit it constructively. I think we do not necessarily need to see the two working in the same direction all the time. The actual rivalry maybe creates opportunities to create something new. And for example, there's nothing stopping the EU from collaborating with China in more constructive approaches in Africa, where there's a direct threat from North Africa to the EU, and there's a exploitation of opportunities by China in Africa and so on. And the same applies to the Middle East. We have done very little really to explore the potential China can do as a stabilizing force, economic force, but also a cultural force in the region. And we have found it very, very difficult to turn our compass away from the West to the East. And I think this pandemic and the way it has unfolded maybe brought to our attention the potential and the risk that is there if we do not engage with China, if we do not get out of our way to understand how things are done at the other side of the world. So my take is yes, there is likely to continue a rivalry, but the rest of us should try and find the best opportunity out of it.
Thank you, Professor Barakat. And actually, there's just one final question here from Ted Daly with Citizens for Global Solutions in Los Angeles. And I'll put this one to Richard, but Reem, I would love to get your thoughts as well on this question. So just let me read the question. Richard, what do you think about this? What is the ideal kind of United Nations system, structure of global order, and ethos of human unity that we ought to set out now to inaugurate by the year 2045?
That's a big question, a good question to end on, and something that we actually give a lot of thought to in our research program. So I'm really glad. I think it's germane to this discussion, which is focused in this Doha Forum report to the next few years. But if we don't have a vision out the next 25 years, we really won't have the roadmap that we need, the longer term focus. And it's indeed important to reflect on this 75th anniversary global conversation that the Secretary General sponsored. Had a lot of talk around 2045, the 100th anniversary of the United Nations. The leader of that effort, under, of course, the leadership of the Secretary General, was the Undersecretary General Fabrizio Hochschild, and was constantly getting out to the younger generation, who, of course, are going to be in their prime and in leadership roles themselves when the UN has its 100th anniversary commemoration. And one would hope that by then, we're going to see the transformational change that is absolutely critical. As we articulate in this report that we're discussing in today's panel, it's both crisis management and dealing with this critical issue of recovery, getting economies, people back to work. That needs to be the focus of the day. But we make the argument that some kind of reform, important modernization of the existing system goes hand in hand. And if one thinks, at least at these intervals of every 5 years of these major anniversaries, we can see some kind of substantive structural changes. By 2045, we might even see the big rebirth of the United Nations. A new model of global governance will likely have emerged by then. We think it will have something to do with multi-stakeholderism, engaging a whole range of new actors, and of course, rising developing countries that weren't even part of the UN's founding conference back in 1945. A final point is that, I'm so glad we talked about the global ceasefire today, because it's amazing that the peace and security agenda is usually getting all the attention, but everything has been overtaken by the pandemic or climate change. cyber attacks. But the fact is, and I'm glad Professor Barakat brought into the conversation, how rising political violence has been a horrific trend in the last 10 years. And there was not cooperation among the great powers on that simple language about endorsing a ceasefire for about 4 or 5 months in the Security Council this past year. And if you can't get the major powers to agree on something basic that's in everybody's interest, just the health saving effects, let alone the wider implications, then we have a real problem. So, you know, I'm so glad Reem is going to comment now, because if the younger generation doesn't take hold of the situation and build the United Nations that they want to see happen, the future that they want, which is also the description of the 75th anniversary, then we're never going to get these major countries to cooperate at the United Nations.
So, Reem, let me get that you have the final word in this discussion. Tell us your thoughts on the reform and modernization of the existing systems that Richard was talking about there, and of course the role of the younger generation in that.
Actually, I'm glad that you did mention this and addressing this question, because in one of the interviews with the younger generations talking about this pandemic, a young man said, we don't want to go back to the old days. We want to have a different future. So this actually inspired me that we need to do more as a younger generation. And the fact that this pandemic has been described as, you know, a problem without border, made us feel that we are very highly connected. We are very similar. What brings us together are much more than what divides us. So we need to show solidarity. We need to show that we need to realize actually that no one is safe until everybody is safe. So, you know, taking this point to the global community, encouraging like a very proactive leadership that will lead these initiatives, that should be where we start from.
Thank you very much. And what a great note to conclude our discussion on. Dr. Reem Al-Mansouri, thank you. And of course, I would like to also thank the other speakers that we've had today, Sheikh Michelle and Brian Finlay, and of course, the other fantastic panelists, Dr. Brundtland, Professor Barakat, and of course, Dr. Richard Ponzio. And thank you very much as well to the organizing team. I've been working with Christina and Banu and others. You can't see or hear them, but they've done a great job putting together today's program. And I'd also like to thank all of you in the audience for joining us today. Really appreciate your participation and your questions. And thank you very much for engaging in the discussion. I think that's a really important part of what we're trying to do here. So yeah, I would like to thank you on behalf of the Doha Forum and the Stimson Center. And don't forget that, of course, the report can be accessed on both of those platforms online. So make sure you check it out. Some great insight there about how global and regional organizations can pull together to respond to the crisis now, and of course to future pandemics and the other challenges as well. I think 2020 has really served as a powerful reminder of the vulnerabilities that we face, but maybe it's also given us the opportunity to show more appreciation and empathy towards each other, and to try and make a positive difference in each other's lives. And also want to remind you about the UN General Assembly's COVID-19 response high-level meeting tomorrow and Friday, which Richard mentioned earlier. That's going to be broadcast on UN Web TV. So that meeting taking place. Do enjoy the rest of your week. Thank you very much for joining us. Until next time.